Okay, it's my privilege to welcome all of you to the fourth in our series, working on anti-racism, working toward justice for all people. I'm Lynn Jost. I am the chair of the Center for Anabaptist Studies, and I've enjoyed working together with Dina Gonzalez-Piña, who is the executive director-elect, or are you already inaugurated, as West Coast Mennonite Central Committee, and with Darren Duerksen, who is a professor at Fresno Pacific University. They've been the people who've actually planned and led each of these events. And welcome back to many of you who've been a part of most or all of these events. Some of you have been leaders. Some of you are here today for the first time. That's perfectly fine. We're glad to welcome you as well. And as Mennonite brethren, it's important for us to be addressing this topic. It's not without concern for some, and it's not without joy for others that we are working at this topic. And I'm especially grateful that we have a pastor in the North Carolina Conference who's been helping us a great deal with our questions, and Terry Hunt is a dear brother. He's going to lead us in prayer, and then I'm going to ask Dina to introduce our speaker, Charles. So, Terry, would you please lead us in prayer?
Thank you. Our Father and our God, which art in heaven, we thank you once again for this wonderful opportunity you have afforded us to come together via Zoom, to be able to share, to discern, and to seek you for wisdom and understanding. God, we just pray today that you would open up our hearts, that we'll be able to receive from our dear brother Mark. God, we pray for wisdom for him, and that you would continue to bless him as he leads in the effort, Lord, to educate and enlighten many Christians around the world, and particularly here in the U.S., of the truth of our nation and more the truth about you. So we pray that our time together would be productive and it would be used for kingdom building. And we give you glory and honor and praise. And we thank you again in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Well, good morning or good afternoon to most of us across the country here. This is our first time that we have had a national space for our Native American brother. And I just want to say I feel so honored to have him as part of our webinar series today. This is our final webinar number 4. We've gone through a series of understanding everything from the science of race and racism to the history, the painful experiences of redlining and court decisions and all kinds of stuff. And today, in reality, we are starting for where we actually should have started, which is the Doctrine of Discovery and the space of this land. And so honored to have Mark Charles, a colleague, friend. And so let me read you a little bit about who he is. Mark Charles is a dynamic, and let me use the word dynamic, and thoughtful, provoking public speaker, writer, consultant, the son of an American woman from a Dutch heritage and a Navajo man. He teaches with insight into the complexities of American history regarding race, culture, and faith in order to help forge a path of healing and conciliation for the nation. He is one of the leading authorities on the 15th century Doctrine of Discovery and its influence on the U.S. history and its intersections with modern day society. Mark co-authored, along with Sushan Ra, the new book entitled Unsettling Truths: The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of Doctrine of Discovery. It's available through InterVarsity Press. It was printed in 2019. And side note here, Mark ran as an independent candidate for the U.S. presidency in 2020 election. So just last month or so. Super honored to have our brother, our friend, Mark Charles. So Mark, thank you for saying yes to the invitation today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with all of you today. Please allow me to introduce myself. So, Yate, Mark Charles Yinishia, Sin Bekadina initially, the Tohiglini Bashis Chin, Sin Bekadina Dashachedo to Chini Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineals of people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsin Beke Dine. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Toi Higlini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Beke Dine. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni. That's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge to you today that I moved to where I live now in Washington, D.C. from the Navajo Nation in the Southwest. And where I live today is the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And the Piscataway, they are the nation that they lived here, they hunted here, they farmed here, they fished here, they raised their families here and buried their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they are still here. I've been in events with some of the Piscataway. I've witnessed their welcome to the land. And I want to acknowledge their presence here still, and I want to honor them and thank them for their stewardship of these lands as the Indigenous hosts, the people Indigenous to these lands. So it's great to be with you, and thank you for having me today. Am I just going to start right into this now, or is there something else we have to do before we begin? Okay. Well, so let me prepare you for a few moments here. We're going to take about 2 hours today to talk about the doctrine of discovery. We're not going to go into all of this stuff. I've actually lectured for as long as 4 or 5 hours on this topic, and I've presented multi-day conferences on this topic. So there's a lot of information here. We're going to cover a big section of the book. Again, the book that I published with my co-author, Soong-Chan Rah, is called Unsettling Truths. It's been doing very well. We're very excited about the conversations it's generating. And we've broken our session up today into 2 pieces. The first piece, I'll take about 35 to 40 minutes to lecture, is about how the church got from the teachings of Jesus to the doctrine of discovery. I'll present that material, and then we'll take about 15 to 20 minutes to do some Q&A, and then we'll do a second half of the presentation, which is on the history of the doctrine of discovery and what it's done within our nation and how it's impacted us, not only a few hundred years ago, but even today in the world we're living in right now. We'll also take some time after that, another 15, 20 minutes to do some Q&A. I need to warn you, over the next 2 hours, I'm going to be presenting some things and talking about some things that many of you have never heard before. And there may be some points in this next 2 hours where you feel very uncomfortable or even unsettled. And I want to encourage you to stay with us, to keep engaged. You're going to be tempted to turn off your computer or even throw something at the screen, but stay connected. We'll get through it. We'll get to a better place. But there's a lot of things we have to talk about, both as Christians as well as American citizens, before we can really have an in-depth discussion on what do we do and where do we go from here. So let me take a moment to share my screen with you so that you can see some of the slides I'm presenting, and then we will go from there. So give me just a second to share my screen. Okay, can you see that? I'm thinking everything's going to be okay. Okay, so what I would like to actually move something around just a moment so I can actually see you a little bit. Hold on just a second. There we go. Okay, so one of the things we have to talk about is how did we get from the teachings of Jesus to this dehumanizing doctrine of discovery, right? Jesus taught things, he said things such as to love your enemies, to pray for those who persecute you. And how did we get from a teacher who taught that way to a doctrine that basically gave the church authority to kill people who didn't think, act, believe, or eat like them? And so to understand this history, we really have to go back into not only the Bible, but into the teachings of Jesus, and even beyond that, before that, to the Old Testament Israel's understanding of land covenant. So in the Old Testament, the people of Israel had a land covenant with the God of Abraham. And this land covenant basically set up what I would call a barometer of prosperity. In other words, it set up a relationship with them and a barometer for their relationship with God, because the land covenant said if they obeyed God and kept his commands, they would be blessed by him. And if they disobeyed God and did not keep his commands, then they would actually be exiled from the lands. And so they had this sense of a barometer of prosperity, where the people of Israel knew that if they were prosperous, if their borders were strong, if they were healthy, if their families were well fed, if their kingdom was doing good, they could take a clue that they were doing well in their relationship with God. If they were exiled from their land, if they were removed from them, if their borders were not strong, if their families were hungry or they were being invaded, they would have a good idea that there was something awry, something amiss in their relationship with God. We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 30, where it says that, but if our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. This is the words of God through Joshua and Moses talking to the people of Israel as they were standing on the banks of their promised land, the Jordan River, to cross over and take possession of them, to take possession of their promised lands. And so when Jesus came into the world, he knew that he was coming into a people who had this barometer, who had this expectation of what they were looking for, what they were expecting. And early on in his ministry, even how he came to earth, he had to adjust some of those expectations. So yes, he came as the Messiah, but he was actually born in a barn, and he grew up as a refugee in Egypt. Yes, angels announced his coming, but they were singing to shepherds. Yes, he was the Son of God, but he was raised in the backwater town of Nazareth. See, the people of Israel, when Jesus came into this world, they were not free. They were under the oppression of the Roman emperor. They were not able to travel freely. They weren't able to worship freely. They were not completely exiled from their lands, but they were not free on their lands either. And they were waiting for a Messiah. Someone, a messenger from God, a Messiah from God, to come and to throw off their Roman oppressors, to restore them in their land and in their rights to worship freely, to restore them even in their own temple, and to bring them back to the greatness of the kingdom of David. Right, the kingdom of David was really one of the golden years of the Jewish and the kingdom of Israel, where he was a mighty king. He was a man after God's own heart. He expanded their borders and kept them secure. And even his son was one of the wealthiest kings in all of Israel's history. And the people of Israel, at the time of Jesus' coming, they were being oppressed by the Romans, and they were waiting for a Messiah to come and to restore them back militarily, imperially, back to the kingdom of David. And so Jesus, he came in this way that didn't lend itself to that thinking. But even early on in his ministry, we see him trying to change expectations. In Matthew 4, when Satan takes him in temptation to a high place and he shows him all the kingdoms of the world, and he offers Jesus what he thought was the goal, which was an earthly kingdom. And he said, if you bow down to me and worship me, I'll give you all of these kingdoms. Jesus resists that temptation, rebukes Satan, and walks away. At one point, John the Baptist in Luke chapter 7, John was the messenger who came before Jesus. He was talking about the coming of this Messiah who was going to be even greater than he was. And at one point in John's ministry, he was in jail, and he heard reports that Jesus was going to centurions and healing their servants, and that he was raising the children of widows from the dead. Now, this was not the image of this imperial militaristic Messiah that John the Baptist expected, that all of Israel expected. And John the Baptist was very confused. How could a widow help usher in this kingdom? How could helping the enemy, a centurion, help usher in this new kingdom? And so he, even from prison, he sent his disciples to Jesus to ask them, are you the one who's coming, or should we expect somebody else? I love Jesus' response. He turns around, heals more of the sick, casts out more demons, gives sight to more of the blind, healing to more of the deaf. And he tells John's disciples to go back and tell their master what they've seen. And he says, blessed is the man who does not fall away on my account. Basically, he's rebuking John, saying, this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. I am the Messiah, but I'm not fitting the image that you're looking for. Either get on board or get out of the way. In John, there's this story where Jesus was teaching, and there were 5,000 men, probably 15 to 20,000 men, women, and children. And he was teaching them for a while, and they were hungry. They find this kid, they take his lunch. Jesus feeds everybody with this small child's lunch. And the people are so excited by what he did that they came to make him king by force. But Jesus was adamant. He did not come to establish an earthly kingdom. And he walked away. In Mark chapter 8, he's with his disciples, teaching them. He's been showing them his role as the Messiah, his entire ministry up until that point. And he asked his disciple, who do people think I am? John the Baptist has been killed, and he's been out ministering for a while now. And they say, well, some think you're John the Baptist returned. Others think you're one of the Old Testament prophets. Some even think you're Elijah. Jesus says, well, who do you think I am? Peter, who's always bold to answer, says, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. It's fascinating that Jesus doesn't congratulate him. He doesn't get excited and say, good, you figured it out. Now let's go on and do some really good things. No, he acknowledges his answer, but then he says, don't tell anybody. And immediately after that, Jesus begins to teach them that the Messiah, the Son of Man, must actually be persecuted, suffer, and even be crucified. This is so contrary to what they expected, that Peter takes his own teacher aside and starts to rebuke him. Jesus sees what's happening. He sees the disciples watching this, and he turns to Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. You're not on the side of God, but of men. Jesus then goes on to teach the disciples that not only will he, the Messiah, be persecuted, but they will also suffer and be persecuted. In Luke chapter 21, he says, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors, all on my account. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, he promised his disciples. See, he then goes on in Matthew and in other parts where he teaches in the Sermon on the Mount. And he tells them that they are blessed, not when they prosper, but when they're persecuted. See, Jesus is trying to give his disciples a new barometer. Their old barometer was one of prosperity. When they were wealthy, when they were rich, when they were satisfied, when they were secure, that's when they knew they were doing well with God. Jesus is teaching them that they will know they are doing well in their discipleship, not when they prosper, but when they're persecuted. For that's even what happened to the Old Testament prophets. He's changing the barometer on them, and the disciples absolutely do not like that idea. Again, Peter tries to rebuke Jesus and gets called Satan. At one point, there's this passage in Mark where the disciples come to Jesus, and they're pretty excited because they found someone who was casting out demons and healing the sick in Jesus' name, but he wasn't one of them. He wasn't a part of their group. And the disciples made him stop. They came to Jesus and reported this. They were pretty proud of what they had done. And Jesus tells them, don't tell them to stop. Anyone who gives you a cup of water surely will not lose their reward. But then he goes on to warn them. He says, if you cause one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better if you tied a millstone around your neck and jumped into the ocean. He said, if your hand causes you to believe you're better than someone else, cut it off. It's better to enter life maimed than with two hands to be thrown into hell. He says, if your eye causes you to believe you're better than someone else, gouge it out. It's better to go into life blind than with two eyes to be thrown into hell. It's interesting. Jesus saves his most stark warnings, his most intimate threats, not for the Roman oppressors who were keeping them from worshiping God, not from the Pharisees and the Sadducees and teachers of the law who were not teaching what God really wanted. He wasn't threatening the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the sinners, the people who were openly breaking God's law. No, his strongest threats he saved for his disciples when they started believing that because they were with Jesus, they were somehow better, somehow above, somehow prosperous over everybody else around them. In Mark chapter 14, Jesus is about ready to be taken prisoner by the Romans and the religious leaders. And he's in the garden and he's modeling for his disciples what they must do in the midst of temptation. He shows them how to pray, but the disciples fall asleep. When the guards come and they take Jesus prisoner, the disciples who are not ready actually break out their swords and they actually try to take up battle. And one of them ends up slashing off the ear of one of the servants of the priests. Jesus rebukes his disciples, picks the guy's ear back up, puts it on, and then all of his disciples leave. And they allow Jesus to be led away by himself and even crucified by himself. Even when Jesus is before Pilate, right? Pilate doesn't want to crucify Jesus. He doesn't find anything wrong that he's done. He wants to set him free, but Jesus isn't answering his questions. And Pilate says to him, "Don't you know I have the authority to set you free or to kill you?" Jesus kind of scoffs at him, says, "You have no authority. You only have what my Father in heaven gave you." He said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants, the angels, not the disciples who I call my friends, would fight to prevent my arrest. But no," he said, "my kingdom is from another place." So even up to his death, Jesus was absolutely adamant. He did not come to establish a militaristic, imperial, earthly kingdom. He was adamant all the way up until his death that his kingdom was somewhere else. And he was not here to create an earthly Christian kingdom or empire. That was not his goal. It actually wasn't until Pentecost that the disciples began to get this message. Most of the Gospels, they are fighting with Jesus about this barometer he's trying to give them of persecution, trying to fight him on this understanding of what they consider great and what Jesus considers great, fighting him on this understanding of where the kingdom is that he's leading towards. And it's not until Pentecost that the disciples finally get it, after Jesus is killed and rises from the dead and even returns back to heaven. And when the Holy Spirit comes, the disciples finally get it. And most of the disciples go on to die a martyr's death. And so in the first century, when you had this small church and you joined this church through your baptism, your confession, your discipleship, and your community, when you became a part of this church, you knew that you were standing in opposition to empire. And you knew that there was a good chance you would be persecuted and maybe even killed because of your membership in this church. Now, in the 4th century, there was the Bishop of Caesarea, Eusebius, and he set out to do something that hadn't been done fully to that point, which he wanted to record the ecclesiastical history, the history of the church. So in the early 4th century, he set out to write this ecclesiastical history. It's actually a volume of 11 books written by Eusebius, who was the Bishop of Caesarea. And in his book, the first several books of this volume establish the deity of Christ, and the beginning with the children who were killed after Jesus was born, kind of skirting over his ministry and then picking up with the stoning of Stephen. Eusebius then goes on to document the martyrs of the church, the people who were persecuted for their faith in Christ. And he holds them up as pious people who are sharing in the suffering of Christ. You can see in his writings the deep respect he has for these people who willingly give up their lives, just like Christ, to share in his suffering. Now, around book 8, we see a shift in his writings. And in book 8, Eusebius introduces a character named Constantinius, who is Constantine's father. And he holds him up as a pious man. And then he introduces Constantine. And he identifies Constantine as an ordained emperor of God. This is surprising because all the way up to this point in this book, the church has been suffering and persecuted at the hands of the Roman Empire. And now suddenly Eusebius is identifying an emperor who he is claiming is ordained by God. And this emperor's name is Constantine. Now, all of my life, I've blamed the heresy of Christian empire on Constantine, right? He converts to Christianity. He makes the Roman Empire Christian, fundamentally changes what it means to be the church. Instead of joining the church through baptism, confession, discipleship, you now become a member of the church because you're a citizenship in this empire. All my life, I've blamed the heresy of Christendom on Constantine. But as I was reading through and looking closely at the writings of Eusebius, I realized the heresy actually is rooted in his book right here, Ecclesiastical History. You see, between books 8 and 9, Eusebius inserts a book. It's called the Book of the Martyrs. And this book is about the great persecution which took place in 304 AD. It's one of the bloodiest persecutions in the history of the church. And in fact, in his book, the Book of the Martyrs, Eusebius identifies that he actually knew many of the martyrs personally as it was taking place in Caesarea and Palestine. And he saw some of their deaths himself. And after that book, end of book 8, going into book 9, Eusebius's whole tone towards martyrs began to change. And now instead of focusing on the piety of the martyrs, he begins looking more closely at the emperors and what can be done to end this persecution. And so if you understand this book that Eusebius is writing, Ecclesiastical History, you know that if you're writing a book called The History of the Church, that your book technically does not have a conclusion, right? Because the history of the church won't conclude until the bridegroom of the church returns, who is Christ. So by virtue of the fact that you're writing the book, it identifies the church history is still ongoing. It hasn't ended. And so you're merely writing an early chapter or an episode in this long saga. But if you read Eusebius's version of Ecclesiastical History, all the way down to the final chapter of the final book, you will see that Eusebius absolutely has a conclusion. The title of his last chapter is The Victory of Constantine and the Blessings Under Him Accrued to the Whole Roman World. He says, at the time they celebrated and extolled, first of all, God, the universal king, because thus they were taught. Then they also celebrated the praises of the pious emperor, and with him all of his divinely favored children. The supreme God granted from heaven above the fruits of his piety, the trophies of victory over the wicked, and that nefarious tyrant with all his counselors and adherents he cast prostrate, not at the feet of Christ, but at the feet of Constantine. See, Eusebius's version of Ecclesiastical History absolutely has a conclusion. And his conclusion is the salvation that comes to Rome, not through Christ, but through Constantine. Why? Because if you want to create a heresy known as Christian empire, if you want to end the persecution of the church, if you want to change the barometer from suffering back to prosperity, your biggest obstacle is Christ. So if you want this to take root, you have to write Christ out of ecclesiastical history, because he's going to be your biggest detractor. And we see that's exactly what Eusebius does. He writes Christ out of ecclesiastical history and inserts Constantine. His next book then is just flat out heresy. The Life of the Blessed Emperor Constantine. Chapter 4 was titled How God Honored Constantine. Chapter 6 is titled He was the Servant of God and the Conqueror of Nations. Chapter 7 was titled He Conquered the Entire World. What did Satan promise to Jesus if he would bow down and worship him? The whole world. Chapter 28 was titled How While He Was Praying, God sent him a vision of a cross of light in the heavens at midday with an inscription admonishing him to conquer by that. And chapter 29 was titled How the Christ of God appeared to him in his sleep and commanded him to use his wars a standard made in the form of a cross. Now, there's actually another, this is referring to, of course, the vision seen by Constantine at Melvane Bridge, the Battle of Melvane Bridge. Now, there's another church father who actually had a vision of Christ as well. That was Saul, on his way to Damascus to persecute the Christians. And on his way, Christ met him and blinded him and sent him stumbling into Damascus. He allowed him to sit there for 3 days. Finally, he sent Ananias to him. And he told Ananias to go to Saul and to tell him how much he must suffer on account of Christ's name. Now, why would he say this? Is he punishing Saul? You persecuted me, now you're going to suffer? No. What's the barometer? How do you know you're doing well in your discipleship with Christ? When you suffer. In this vision, and in the message that God gives him, he is telling Paul, this is your barometer now. So when we look at this vision Constantine claims to have seen, and he may have very well seen a vision. I promise you, I guarantee you it was not of Christ. Christ would not appear to the most powerful emperor in the world and tell him to conquer in the name of a cross. No, he would do the exact same thing he did to Saul, the exact same things he did to Peter, the exact same things he did to his apostles and all of his followers. If you want to follow me, he would have said, you must now be prepared to no longer persecute, but to be persecuted. But Constantine claimed he was now to conquer in the name of the cross. So Constantine may have seen a vision. I promise you, it was not of Christ. So in the 5th century, the theologians now have a dilemma. What do? They have this heresy known as Christendom. Do they collude with it or do they prophesy to it? Well, one of the early theologians after Eusebius and after Constantine was Augustine. And Augustine is most well known for his just war theory. And if you read his just war theory, you'll see it really has 2 purposes. First of all, it's to help nations, Christian nations, fight wars more justly. Second, it's to justify how Christian citizens of these Christian nations can now go off and kill in the name of God and country, right? Because a plain text reading of Jesus' teaching doesn't allow this. So the question is, what will the theologians do? And I take the fact that Augustine wrote a just war theory as evidence that he was more trying to collude with the heresy of Christendom than to prophesy to it. But I wanted to see where he crossed the line, right? Because when you cross the line with Christ, he rebukes you. He called another church father Satan when he crossed the line. He told Paul that you have to change your ways. So I wanted to see where Augustine crossed the line. I read through his writings on just war. I read through his writings on the 2 kingdoms. I couldn't find it, but as I came across his writings on the correction of the Donatists, this is in chapter 5 of this book. The Donatists were a heretical group. They were teaching heresy, leading people astray. And in chapter 5, Augustine is wrestling with this question of what's the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? This is a new phenomenon. We've never had this before. We've always been the oppressed people by the empire. Now we have a Christian empire with a Christian king. So what's the role of that person? It's not a bad question, but the question has a horrible premise because the premise accepts the notion that there's such a thing as Christian empire. And so he writes and he concludes that the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to prevent and chastise with religious severity all those acts which are done in opposition to the commands of the Lord. He said he serves him by enforcing with suitable rigor such laws as ordain what is righteous and punishes what is the reverse. In chapter 6, he says it's better that people should be driven to worship of God by teaching than be brought there by fear of punishment or pain. But we found advantage, he said, in first being conquered and being compelled by fear or pain, so that afterwards they might respond to sound teaching. So Augustine's concluding the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to use fear, punishment, and pain to compel people to keep the command of the church and the teachings of Christ. This is clearly out of line with what Jesus ever taught. He never modeled this whatsoever. I'm certain if Christ did not have a problem calling St. Peter Satan and rebuking him, he would not hesitate for a moment to call out St. Augustine, saying, "What are you thinking? This is not on the side of God, but of men." However, this teaching went uncorrected, and it led into what are known as the Crusades. The Crusades were about expanding the empire as well as protecting Jerusalem up through the 11th century. In the 13th century, we have Thomas Aquinas, another theologian, writing. He's also wrestling with the issue of heretics and what do we do with heretics. And he writes that if the secular world has the right to kill people who break men's laws, how much more right does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? He says it's a much graver matter to corrupt the faith which quickens the soul than to forge money which supports temporal life. Wherefore, if forgers of money and other evildoers are forthwith condemned to death by the secular authority, how much more reason is there for heretics, as soon as they are convicted of heresy, to not only be excommunicated, but even put to death? So he's arguing the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to kill people who don't keep the commands of God or the rules of the church. Also in this century, the 13th century, we have the creation of a new group called the infidels. The infidels is a category of other. It's applied to Moors or Muslims and to indigenous peoples, anyone who doesn't worship the God of the white European Christian male. Now that we have this category of infidel, now we don't even need a just war theory. Now our wars are justified on theological grounds because we're fighting the other. We're fighting the enemies of Christ. And so it's out of this that in 1452, Pope Nicholas V writes out these words, and he says, "Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and to their use and profit." This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, are collectively known as what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. This doctrine is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people because they did not believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claimed to have discovered it. If you think about it, you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. You can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, you can even colonize those lands. You cannot discover them unless your belief is that the people who live there are not fully human. This makes the doctrine of discovery a white male Christian supremacist doctrine that is the direct fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to empire, changed its barometer from one of suffering to one of prosperity. Now, initially, the Protestant church pushed back against this doctrine. This was a Catholic doctrine. They didn't fully buy into it. But in 1630, John Winthrop was in what's now known as the Boston Harbor. He was with a group of colonists to plant the Boston colony. And on board this ship, he preached a sermon titled "A Model of Christian Charity." In this sermon, he referred to the colonists that he was with as a city upon a hill. He's borrowing from the language of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he told his disciples to be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining your good deeds into this dark world. He goes on to exhort them in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. They should rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bonds of peace. These are your basic Christian exhortations. At the end of his sermon, John Winthrop is trying to exhort his congregants to keep to obey his teachings or keep his exhortations. And he decides to quote from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, as we saw earlier, Deuteronomy 30 is the passage where the people of Israel are standing at the shores of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And Joshua and Moses are reiterating the threats and promises of their land covenant. If our hearts shall turn away so that we will not obey and we worship other gods, we will surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this river to possess it. Now, Deuteronomy 30 says river, but in his sermon, John Winthrop changes that to vast sea. Now, why would he do that? Well, because he didn't cross a river, he crossed an ocean. So what's he saying? Based on the exhortations of Jesus to be a city on a hill, based on the teachings of Old Testament Israel, they are standing on the banks of their promised land, ready to take possession of them. I call this sermon the birth of American exceptionalism. This idea percolates for about 100 years. We have this idea because if we look at how promised lands are to be acquired, in Deuteronomy 20, 16 and 17, it says, however, in the cities of the nations that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, as the Lord your God has commanded you. One of the books I highly recommend on the Doctrine of Discovery is written by a native author, native academic. His name is Stephen Newcomb. His book is titled Pagans in the Promised Land. I'm convinced one of the reasons he chose that name is because of this passage. Because according to the Old Testament, when you have promised lands, you're commanded by God to commit genocide against the pagans who live in your promised land. Promised lands for one group of people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. That idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, our nation begins expanding westward. We go past the Appalachian Mountains, past the Mississippi River. End of the 1700s, we have the Second Great Awakening. There's a growth in churches, a renewal of denominations. Early 1840s, we have this notion of a manifest destiny. This belief that this nation has a God-given right to rule this continent from sea to shining sea. This idea is so deeply ingrained and embedded in American psyche, even to today. And we see this just a few years ago in 2015. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, was here in the United States. And he was lobbying against the nuclear deal that the Obama administration was negotiating with Iran. He was invited to speak against protocol to a very partisan Congress. That Congress, just like today, was not even talking to each other. There was a deep divide between the right and the left. And Benjamin Netanyahu had to get everyone on board with him behind his line of thinking. And so early in his speech, he hit on one of the most unifying themes in American politics, which is the theme of American exceptionalism. And he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. You see, the United States of America and the modern nation state of Israel have a very dysfunctional and codependent relationship, has nothing to do with liberty and justice or equality. It's about co-opting this Old Testament understanding of promised lands. We need Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised lands to justify what we did to Native peoples and African people. And the modern nation state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they're doing to Bedouins and Palestinians. We have a deeply dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the modern nation state of Israel. Has nothing to do with liberty, justice, or equality. It's all about justifying oppression, and in our case, even genocide. There's a passage, I won't have time to read it right now, but I will put it in the chat later. I wrote it for Thanksgiving. I wrote it 2 years ago in 2018. And it's basically wrestling with my understanding of Thanksgiving and why, based on the history that came out of this doctrine of discovery, I can no longer celebrate the holiday of Thanksgiving. If you look at, and I'll just give you a little insight into this passage, when it was Abraham Lincoln who brought Thanksgiving into the modern era with a proclamation he wrote in 1863. And he wrote it in October, delivered it for, and set aside the last Thursday in November as a day of Thanksgiving. And if you look back at the things he is giving thanks for, which is the expansion of land and the growth of our population and the securing of our borders, the things he is thanking God for, even in the year just prior to that, the year of 1863, Abraham Lincoln had ethnically cleansed the Dakota and Winnebago from the lands of Minnesota. He had literally was in the process in October and November of 1863 of sending his soldiers into the territory of New Mexico to round up Navajo people, my own people, and march us down to Bosque Redondo to a death camp where thousands of our people were killed. He was literally ethnically cleansing lands that were en route of the Transcontinental Railway, which is going through the states of Colorado, the states of Minnesota, and the territory of New Mexico. He was committing genocide. And in his Thanksgiving Day proclamation, he was thanking God for the fruits of that genocide and calling the nation to set aside this day as a national day of Thanksgiving. So I'll put the link to that in the chat, but it's a very powerful history, and it's part of the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, which we'll talk about more in our next session, that we don't talk about, which is he was literally one of the most ethnic cleansing and genocidal presidents in our nation's history. And yet we hold him up as our greatest president. So these are just some things I want you to think about. In fact, the history got so bad that in 1949, this is just before Abraham Lincoln's term as president in 1860. In 1841 or 1851, Peter Burnett was the first governor of California. And in his State of the State address, he said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying famine's broken out and we can't feed these people and they're dying. He's not saying disease has spread and we can't stop it and people are dying. He's literally saying we cannot stop killing these people until they're extinct. If we look in Joshua chapter 10, verse 40, we're told, so Joshua subdued the entire region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. This is what is so dangerous about the doctrine of discovery. This is what is so dangerous about the perversion of the church in throwing off the understanding and the barometer of suffering and embracing a barometer of prosperity. This is what's so incredibly dangerous about the church investing and propping up Christian empire. And I'm convinced this is why Jesus, when his disciples began to think they were better than other people simply because they were with Christ, that he very explicitly broke out the threats of hell. Because he knew how absolutely and incredibly dangerous this was if his followers went on to try to establish and maintain an earthly Christian empire. This is where we are right now. I'll end with this section. And I know we have some time for some Q&A, but we'll pick up with some more of the history after this. But I wanted to end it here so we have a chance to process through some of these things and maybe ask some questions if we want to. How do you want to run this, Dina?
I'm just going to invite folks to unmute themselves and ask them questions. So let's do that.
I'll also just invite people, if you prefer, you can also put them in chat, and Dina, you and I will monitor that as well.
Perfect.
So either way.
Yeah.
Hi, Mark. Dave Sinclair Peters here I'm in Canada. I also work in Myanmar, in the country of Myanmar. So lots of amazing Indigenous tensions there as well. Not only tension, genocide, and all kinds of things. I'm really interested in theologically, how do you go from Old Testament and that prosperity, that idea of prosperity as the barometer, to New Testament and suffering, and especially the scriptures that are talking about how Israel was to go in and take the land and obliterate the people. Where do you, just in terms of the Bible itself, not in terms of how Christians now have misappropriated scripture, but just in terms of the Bible, how do you deal with that?
Well, so one of the ways I deal with it, right, is I look at as God is revealing himself over time to his people. So if you go all the way back to the book of Genesis and God's dealing with Abraham, right? God tests Abraham how? He says, sacrifice your son. Now, can God test any of us that way today? No, he can't. He absolutely couldn't. If anyone comes to you and says, I think God told me to kill my child, no, he didn't. He absolutely did not. Why? Well, now we have the 10 commandments, right? Thou shalt not kill, you shall not murder. God's not going to contradict himself. He hadn't given those commandments there, and so he's revealing himself. And so in the Old Testament, we see he chooses the people of Israel. He sets them apart as his nation. He's revealing himself to the world through the people of Israel. And when I look at the Old Testament, what I see God working out his judgment. So God is a God of justice, but he's also a God of mercy. And we see that multiple times. And so the way he dealt with his justice is he had set up a sacrificial system so that he demanded blood. So he let his people sacrifice animals to atone for their sins. And they would have to do this on a regular basis. We also see that God was very much using the nations to judge Israel when they got out of line. And he was using the Israel to judge the nations as they were out of line. And much of the Old Testament is God going back and forth with this judgment. When Christ comes as the final sacrifice, offering his blood for the atonement for all sin, now that that justice part of God's character is satisfied, right? He's that sin has been paid for. Now he's able to call his church into this ministry of mercy, this ministry of sharing God's love and calling people to follow Christ and modeling and doing something even much radically different than what they've done in the past. And so with Christ, there comes this revelation of, Jesus is really trying to, again, he changes the barometer. Yes, in the Old Testament, there's this barometer of prosperity. Jesus is very clear to change that in his teachings in the New Testament. And he tells his disciples, you're going to be blessed not when you're prospering, but when you're persecuted. He's very clear about that. Now, you could also argue that Jesus is really focused on the Jewish community in his ministry. And it's really not until Acts chapter 10, this is after Pentecost, and we see it with Cornelius, when the disciples see the Spirit of God fall even on the Gentiles. They're surprised by this in Acts chapter 10 and 11. They're a bit shocked by this. But this is something new. Now they see the Spirit of God not only coming down on people who converted to Judaism, but people who were clearly living a Gentile lifestyle. Like they were completely separate from the Jewish community. He saw it fall on Cornelius, and now it's about building this inclusive church that isn't even defined by Jew versus Gentile. And so I see God doing these revelations, revealing himself more and more. I was actually discipled by a friend of mine, and he's a Messianic Jew who lives in Israel. And I met him through the World Christian Gathering on Indigenous Peoples. He was on a journey with me to understand contextualizing worship for Indigenous peoples. And one of the things that he hit me hardest with when I spent some time with him in Israel, we had a kind of a partnership discipleship where I spent some time in Israel with him and he spent time with me on the Navajo Nation, and we discipled each other in our own context. And when I got to Israel, he said to me, he said, Mark, your entire life as an American Christian, you've been trained to read the Old Testament of the Bible incorrectly. You've been trained to read like that is a bunch of documents written to you. And it's not. Those were documents written about God's relationship with the people of Israel in that time, in that period. And you can't claim those promises. One of the things I tell people the most clearly when I talk about this history is the United States of America is not God's chosen people. We do not have a land covenant with the God of Abraham. I'll talk more about this in my next section when I talk about lament. But we have this belief. This is where this myth of American exceptionalism comes in. We think that we have a unique relationship as Americans with the God of Israel. We don't. We don't have a land covenant. And we have to understand that. And we live under a different barometer, the barometer of suffering, not the barometer of prosperity.
I have a question, Mark. You talk about American exceptionalism, and I'm hearing that from you. Well, are there other countries, nations? I'm thinking about South Africa in particular, where there was a similar sense that God had called them to a particular place. They took permission from God to conquer and kill in a similar way as we have.
Yeah. So this is what's the biggest challenge we face is. This Doctrine of Discovery comes out of Europe. It wasn't born here. It came out of the church in Europe, and it was basically the church in Europe saying to the nations, wherever you go, whatever lands you find. So the world was colonized under this belief that they had this doctrine of discovery, this right of God to establish Christian empire anywhere they went. And so we see this in South Africa, we see this in New Zealand, we see this all throughout the continent of Africa, we see it throughout parts of Asia, and all over the world we see this. One of the most fascinating journeys I was on was when I was a part of a group called the World Christian Gathering on Indigenous Peoples. I was a part of this group from maybe 2003 up until 2012 or so. We met every few years, every year or two, in different countries around the world, hosted by Indigenous Christians. And everyone in that group was on a journey of decolonizing the gospel. The experience of most Indigenous Christians, not just in the US, but throughout the globe, is that they were colonized by some country in Western Europe, and they were Christianized by that same country. And the message was that you have to give up your pagan rituals, your pagan understandings, and you have to become Western European and worship our God. And so almost not every, but a lot of Indigenous Christians around the world were colonized by the gospel. And there's been a renaissance, if you will, of these Christians beginning to ask, what does it mean to be Indigenous and still follow Christ? How does my language, how does my understanding of the sacred, how does my worldview, how does my regalia, how does my food impact the way that I follow Christ and I worship God? And being a part of that group was a huge eye-opener for me, of seeing how these groups of Christians are untangling themselves from the colonial gospel. There's a great forum that I've been not a part of, but I've been in relationship with from some of the people who were at the World Christian Gathering. It's called NATES, which is the North American Institute of Indigenous Theological Studies. It was started by Terry LeBlanc. Richard Twist was also a big part of this when he was alive. And it's basically Native Christians self-theologizing, right? They are coming to the scriptures within the worldview of Native America and doing theology. They have a forum every year. They have a journal they put out every year. They help authors get published. They're doing a lot of work to help Native American Christians become self-theologizing. You know, there's nothing in the scripture that says white men from Europe have the cornerstone on theological discourse. And so they're actually doing some really groundbreaking work. I encourage people to look them up. It's NAIITS.org. NATES.org is the website, and it's the North American Institute of Indigenous Theological Studies. And was a huge. It's a great eye opener for a lot of people to see how that process is taking place.
Mark, my wife and I worked in Panama with indigenous peoples for about 7 years. I had grown up in California, where all of my schooling and all of my church experience taught me to celebrate Columbus Day. And it was a great celebration because there was something special about that. And then I worked with the Wonan and Eminat people, and for the first time in my life, I came to realize what that really was.
Yeah.
And it changed my entire outlook. Why have we done that, both in the schools and in the church? I guess you've talked about that, but please.
Yeah, we're going to go into that much more in depth in our next session when we look very closely at our nation's history and what we've done with the Doctrine of Discovery. But what I would say it boils down to, well, there's a lot of things that are in that question. One of the challenges is, and we point this out in our book, history is written by the victors. And one of the biggest challenges the United States of America faces is that we've never lost a war that matters. We've never been invaded. We've never given up land. We've never been demilitarized. We've never had a regime change. We've never surrendered and given up strategic place. We've never lost a war that matters. As a result, we've been able to write our own history for essentially 250 years. What that means is a lot, and I'll demonstrate this very clearly in the next section. A lot of what we understand to be American history is actually a myth. It's not rooted in historical fact. And because of this, because we've written our own history and we've tainted it and twisted it to prop ourselves up as the good guys, that's been really dangerous. We see this we see it in a lot of places, even in World War II, right? And today our country is one of the leading voices of deciding who does and who does not get to have nuclear weapons. Well, guess what? We're the only country in the world that's ever used nuclear weapons in a time of war. We literally killed over 300,000 civilians in Japan with our bombings. In our book, we lay out some of that history. And Robert McNamara, who was serving under General LeMay in Japan, he was an analyst, and he was analyzing our bombings. And he recommended to LeMay that we fly our bombers lower because they were not hitting their targets well, because they were dropping through the jet stream, and we didn't understand the jet stream very well back in the 1940s. And so they started flying their bombs lower, and they were actually much more accurate. That wasn't even and the most deadly bombing in World War II wasn't even Nagasaki or Hiroshima. It was Operation Meeting House, the incendiary bombing of Tokyo, where we killed over 100,000 people in a single bombing raid, and just burned the city. And we chose that city because it was wooden and we knew it would burn hotter. And so we literally killed 300,000 bombers, or 300,000 civilians, through all of our bombings in Japan. It was so bad that in his documentary, The Fog of War, Robert McNamara remembers a conversation he had with General LeMay. And General LeMay said, if we lose this war, we, talking to McNamara and these other commanders, he said, we will be tried as war criminals. And McNamara agreed. He said he was right. We were behaving as war criminals. Why weren't they charged as war criminals? Because they weren't committing a crime? No, because we won the war. It's the only reason they were never charged with war crimes is not because we weren't committing crimes, it's because we won the war. And so we gave awards to McNamara and to LeMay and others and held them up as heroes. Meanwhile, the Germans, they were tried for war crimes. We both were committing crimes. The difference is who won the war. That's the biggest challenge our nation faces, is we've won all of our wars. Therefore, we've never had to deal with the crimes, not only against our own citizens, but against humanity that we've committed for 250 years.
For this next part, I'm going to invite folks to write your questions or even your comments as you are affirming or processing what Mark is sharing with us. Write them in the chat. I know that this next hour is going to go really fast, and there's going to be some opportunities at the end here to process quickly. But I just invite you to do that space. And Mark, thank you. Let's start with part 2.
Okay. All right, now we're going to go into some of the history of our country. And let me bring up my slideshow here. Okay, so now I want to talk about the Doctrine of Discovery and the way it's been embedded into our foundations. So we've already seen how the Doctrine of Discovery, it's a white supremacist Christian doctrine, and the fruit of a church that's prostituted itself out to empire. We've seen how we've used it to justify this notion that our country has promised lands. We've talked a little bit about some of the history that that's led to. But the challenge with the Doctrine of Discovery, one of the biggest challenges, is the way it gets embedded into our foundations. So in 1763, King George draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains. And he said to the colonies that were here that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king. Hold on, I missed my click here somewhere. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on to state state, I missed something here. They went on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. He then signed their document on July 4th of 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the Founding Fathers used this inclusive term all men is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. So what this means is that our Declaration of Independence is a systemically white supremacist document that assumes the dehumanization of indigenous peoples and other peoples of color. Now, a few years after this, our Founding Fathers wrote another document. This one, they began with the words, "We the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. However, if you keep reading this, just a few lines later, down to Article 1, Section 2, This is the section of the Constitution that decides who is and who is not included in this union, who is and who is not covered by this document. The first thing we note in Article 1, Section 2 is that it never mentions women. Second, well, then this is important because if you read the entire Constitution, from the preamble all the way down to the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns. 51 he, him, and his. Who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by the document. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. So we have to know Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Well, in 1787, that literally left white men. And technically, it was white landowning men who could vote. See, we don't stop and ponder this frequently enough. The reason we wrote a constitution, the purpose of the Constitution, was to protect the interests of white landowning men. So today we act surprised that our prisons are filled with people of color. This isn't surprising, the Constitution's working. We act surprised that women earn 60 to 70 cents to the dollar. This isn't surprising, the Constitution's working. People get upset that in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This is what opens the door for super PACs, unlimited support for candidates. This isn't surprising. The Constitution is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. Now, many people think that we've corrected this. Well, we did try. We passed what's known as the 13th Amendment. Most people think the 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. That's actually not what it says. What it says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. See, the 13th Amendment doesn't actually abolish slavery. It redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. So we have to look at what are our incarceration rates like. Well, it should surprise no one that we incarcerate our citizens at the highest rate of any country in the world. For every 100,000 citizens, we incarcerate 693 of them. That's 110 higher than the next nation, which is Turkmenistan, and about 3 to 5 times higher than most other nations. This chart is merely comparing us to NATO nations, and you can see we're completely off the chart with them. And when we look at the breakdown by race, it's even worse. We incarcerate Hispanics and Latinos at a rate of 831 per 100,000, American Indians rate of 895 per 100,000, and Black Americans are incarcerated at a rate of 2,306 per 100,000. We, of course, incarcerate white people at a much more palatable rate of 450 per 100,000. So we just have to be honest. The 13th Amendment doesn't actually abolish slavery. It keeps it legal within our criminal justice system. And this criminal justice system is used today as a completely legal form, a legal space to remove the civil rights and even enslave people of color. Years later, we passed the 14th Amendment. This was an amendment in direct response to Article 1, Section 2. The 14th Amendment actually granted the rights of citizenship to anyone born on this continent under the jurisdiction of the government. However, if you keep reading, just a few lines later, down to Section 2, we'll see that they still specifically exclude natives, they still specifically exclude women, and they still make the civil rights protected by the criminal justice system. And so while this amendment extends some rights of citizenship to a few former male slaves temporarily, it still leaves disenfranchised and marginalized huge segments of the Constitution. This was written in 1868. After this amendment, we still had Indian boarding schools, we still had Indian massacres, we still had Jim Crow laws, we still had internment camps, we still had mass incarceration, we still had segregation, we still had families being ripped apart at our borders. And in the 1970s, this was the very same amendment used in Roe versus Wade, which now determined that unborn babies weren't human enough to be protected by the Constitution, and therefore they could be aborted. What this demonstrates is that our Constitution does not have a value for life. And actually, the precedent is one of dehumanization. So this makes our Constitution a systemically white supremacist, racist, and sexist document that assumes the white landowning male has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. Now, a few years after this, about 100 years later, we had a Supreme Court case. It was called Johnson versus Macintosh. These are two men of European descent. They're in litigation over a single piece of land. One of them claimed to have got the land from a native tribe. The other one said they got the same land from the government. They want to know who owned it, who had the right to sell the land. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The court had to determine the principle that land titles were based on. This was the John Marshall Court, and they ruled that the principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subject or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, and that title was consummated by possession. They then go on to reference the Doctrine of Discovery and use this to determine that even though natives were here first, but because we're savages, we only have the right of occupancy to the land, while Europeans have the right of discovery to the land, and therefore they are the true title holders. This case in 1863 creates, or in 1823, creates the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the Doctrine of Discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. I want to talk for a moment about this 2005 case. When our nation was founded, the Oneida Indian Nation occupied about 6 million acres of land in what is now Central State New York. George Washington's administration reduced that land holding down to just a few 100,000 acres through some treaties. They then passed a law stating that only the federal government could buy or sell land from Native nations, and that this land specifically was set aside for the Oneida Indian Nation. The state of New York continued to illegally purchase land from the Oneida Indian Nation until all the lands were bought up and the Oneida were moved out of the state of New York. In the 1990s, the Oneida Indian Nation came back into New York and they purchased some of their traditional lands. They bought them on the open market. They paid full price for them. And they wanted to reestablish some of their ancient sovereignty over these lands. Now, the lands they bought were within the city limits of what is now the city of Sherrill. And the city of Sherrill wanted the tax revenue from these lands, which they were not getting because of the sovereignty of the Oneida Indian Nation. And so they sued the Oneida Indian Nation in federal district court. The Oneida Indian Nation won, and so the city of Sherrill appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals, and that decision was upheld. So they appealed a second time to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court heard the case in 2004-2005. In their opinion that they released in 2005, in the first footnote of the case, they reversed the decision of the lower courts. And in the first footnote of the case, they reference by name the Doctrine of Discovery. They then go on to state that given the long-standing, distinctly non-Indian character of the area and its inhabitants, the regulatory authority constantly exercised by the state of New York, and the Oneida's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. They then go on to reference another case that said it's impossible to rescind the cession and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been open to settlement, which again was white settlement, and large portions of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. Now, in 1823, when John Marshall was writing the original case, the original opinion, he actually referred to natives as savages. He said, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness. In 2005, the Supreme Court made a very similar argument. They said, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the United sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the United sought to regain ancient sovereignty over lands converted from wilderness to become parts of a city like Cheryl. They're making the same argument, they're just not using the word savages. So in 2005, the Supreme Court concludes that we now reject the unification theory of the United Indian Nation and the United States and hold that standards of federal Indian law, again, footnote 1, Doctrine of Discovery, and federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is quite possibly one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And it was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, many people ask how? How could she have written this opinion? Wasn't she the justice who was fighting for the marginalized? Wasn't she the justice who was fighting for those who didn't have rights under the Constitution? Yes, she was. But the problem is because land titles are based on the legal conclusion that natives are savages, this actually makes white supremacy a bipartisan value. So much that even when push comes to shove, even the most liberal of judges who are advocating for the most marginalized will agree with the system and uphold this ruling based on the doctrine of discovery. This means the United States Supreme Court is a systemically white supremacist court that to this day has legal precedent, legal opinions based on the dehumanization of indigenous peoples and other people of color. We talked already about how now that we have this history, now that we have a white supremacist doctrine of discovery, a white supremacist Declaration of Independence, a white supremacist racist and sexist constitution, a white supremacist Supreme Court, and God's permission to commit genocide, now we have this history that goes on. And I want to talk about the 19th century. The 19th century is the portion of our history that we refer to as our history of expansion. It's during the 19th century that we add about 30 new states to our union. I created this graph several years ago. It looks at our history of this chart. It looks at our history from 1775 to 2016. Every year in blue is a year that I found our nation was in a declared state of war or armed military conflict against another nation or entity. Every year in red is every year I found that we were fighting against native nations. You'll see that from 1811 to 1886, we were in almost 75 straight years of warfare against native nations. These are the list of wars I found that we fought primarily during the 19th century. So clearly this was not a century of expansion. This was a century of ethnic cleansing and genocide. It was during this century that we passed the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act is basically the precedent used by Congress that gave the military the right by force to remove nations, native nations, from their lands in the east to more empty lands further in the west. This resulted in the Trail of Tears for the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Long Walk for the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache. All told, about a dozen tribes experienced forced relocation because of this act, and tens of thousands of Native peoples died as a direct result of this act. In 1862, we have the largest mass execution in the history of our country with the hanging of the Dakota 38. This was ordered by Abraham Lincoln. In 1864, we have 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children slaughtered in a single day by a US Army that was led by a Methodist general. In 1879, we have the start of Indian boarding schools. The purpose of these boarding schools was to kill the Indian to save the man. There are many boarding school survivors alive throughout this day. I've sat with several of them. I've listened to their stories. I've read about them. The children were taken from their homes. My grandparents are both Indian boarding school survivors, but the children were taken from their homes. They were put into these military-style boarding schools. They were punished for speaking their languages. They were punished for practicing their culture. the stories of abuse that I've heard, mental, physical, emotional, sexual, that happen in these boarding schools is gut-wrenching. And the last of them didn't close until the 1970s and 80s. In 1890, we had one of the more famous massacres that more of us know about. It's the massacre at Wounded Knee. 350 US soldiers, 350 Dakota people were slaughtered in a single day at this massacre. We talk about this massacre a bit more in our history books, but we don't really talk about the whole history. One of the things we don't talk about is that the US Congress awarded 20 Congressional Medals of Honor to the US soldiers who participated in this massacre. See, at Wounded Knee, the US Army was negotiating with the Dakota people over the surrender of one of the Dakota chiefs. And neither side trusted each other, and there were a lot of weapons present. No one's quite sure who fired the first shot, but a shot was fired and chaos broke out. Now, the US Army had several of these, what are called Hotchkiss cannons at Wounded Knee. These are, they shoot multiple rounds a minute. They're accurate up to a few thousand yards. They had several of them there, and they began raining bullets down on the Dakota people. Now, at Wounded Knee, there's a ravine, a small valley. And when this fighting broke out, many of the Dakota people, especially the women and children, ran into this ravine to seek shelter from these guns that were raining down bullets on them. Now, of the 20 Congressional Medals of Honor that were awarded at Wounded Knee, 3 of them, the one for William Austin, the one for John Grisham, and the one for Albert McMillan, were awarded specifically for their actions of going into the ravine and flushing the natives out. John Grisham, it said he voluntarily led a party into the ravine to dislodge Sioux Indians concealed therein, and he was wounded during the action. William Austin says, while the Indians were concealed in a ravine, he assisted men on the skirmish line, directing their fire, etc., and using every effort to dislodge the enemy. We awarded 20 Congressional Medals of Honor for this massacre, 3 of them specifically to flush the Dakota people out of this ravine where they were seeking shelter. In 1840, this is what our nation looked like. The lands to the east are states. The lands to the west are territories or even uncharted lands. If you go online or you look it up in journals, you can find a list of all the Medals of Honor awarded by the US Congress. And if you look up Medals of Honor awarded for the Indian war campaigns, you will find that between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor to US soldiers who fought in the Indian war campaigns. And at the end of that period, this is what our nation looked like. You can see we've completed our manifest destiny. We've made it all the way to the West Coast. We only have a few territories left, but we have a strong military presence there and are setting those up to become states soon. During this period, the majority population of the US ballooned from 5.3 million to 76.2 million. And the native population collapses from 600,000 to 237,000. If you're doing the math, that's about a 61.47% rate of genocide. If you're comparing your math, that's almost twice the rate of genocide that Nazi Germany had against the Jews during the Holocaust. So there's just no other way to state this. Between 1839 and 1898, the United States Congress awards 425 Medals of Honor for the genocide of American Indians and the ethnic cleansing of this continent. On December 9 of 2009, Congress passes and the White House signs House Resolution 3326. This is the 2010 Department of Defense Appropriations Act. It's the appropriations for the DoD for 2010. It's a 67-page document. Page 45 of this document is titled subsection 8113. It's titled Apology to Native Peoples of the United States. What follows is this 7 bullet point apology. It mentions no specific tribe, no specific treaty, and no specific injustice. It basically says you had some nice lands. Our citizens didn't take it very politely. Let's now call it all of our lands and then we'll steward it together. And then it ends with a disclaimer saying nothing in here is legally binding. To date, this apology has not been announced, read, or publicized by the White House or by Congress. The problem is that we don't teach a history of our country, we teach a mythology. The mythology says we have a legacy of discovery. The mythology says we believe in equality. We have a history of expansion. We're exceptional. The mythology says liberty and justice here exist for everybody. And it says that we're a Christian nation. To show you how deep this mythology runs, let me talk for a few moments about one of our most, what people consider our greatest president, who is Abraham Lincoln. Now, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, when Lincoln was entering the political scene and he was running for senator in the state of Illinois against Judge Stephen Douglas, in these debates, he had to introduce himself to the people of citizens and even somewhat to the nation. And it was known that Abraham Lincoln was against chattel slavery. And so he had to address that during these debates. And during one of the early debates, he said this. He said, "I will say this, that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black race." He says, "I am not, nor have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, or allowing them to hold office, or to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races from living together in terms of social and political equality. And is as much as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." So while Abraham Lincoln was against chattel slavery, he also stated previously in this debate that he had no intention of freeing the slaves in states where slavery already existed. And then he goes on to clearly state that he absolutely believes in the lie of white supremacy. See, he and Judge Douglas actually had a lot of very similar views. They both believed in white supremacy. They disagreed on slavery. Judge Douglas felt that slavery was needed to keep white supremacy intact, and Abraham Lincoln was adamant that they could keep white supremacy intact even without this institution of chattel slavery. Even in his Emancipation Proclamation, which came out, he was very clear where he freed the slaves: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. The states that he left out, 4 states where slavery was legal, which is Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. These were states in the North that did not secede from the Union, and they did not become part of the Confederacy. They were still part of the northern states. And Abraham Lincoln stated that for the accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. So he did not free the slaves in the states in the North that allowed slavery. If you go into the Lincoln Memorial, at the memorial, at the base of the memorial, there's a small museum. It's about the size of a big classroom. On each wall, there are plaques, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide. They're marble plaques. They have writings engraved in on them. They're quotes from Abraham Lincoln about different parts of his legacy. On one wall, there's these set of 5 plaques, and they're about his thoughts on the Union. In the middle of this wall is this plaque that says, "I would save the Union. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It's not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There's a plaque hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally states, according to Abraham Lincoln, Black lives don't matter. I don't know what's more offensive, the fact that he said this or that someone felt it was most appropriate to hang there and celebrate. Again, the problem is we don't teach a history, we teach a mythology. The mythology says discovery, the history says dehumanization. The mythology says equality, the history says only for a select few. The mythology says expansion, the history says ethnic cleansing. The mythology says exceptionalism, the history says genocide. The mythology says liberty and justice for all, the history says liberty and justice for white landowning men. The mythology says Christian nation, the history says we are the next version of what is known as Christendom, this heretical institution of a Christian empire. Now, again, maybe you're thinking, Mr. Charles, it's a bit strong. We don't fully think of ourselves that way anymore. I want you to think back just a few years ago. I think it was 2017, there was a pretty severe terrorist attack in London. And several people were killed. And on the day of that attack, Representative Higgins from the state of Louisiana, on his website, it says that he identifies himself as a Christian who is known for his refreshing focus on the power of the individual to be redeemed. On the day of that attack in London, he wrote this on his public Facebook page. He says, "The free world, all of Christendom, is at war with Islamic horror. Not one penny of American treasure should be granted to these nations who harbor these heathen animals. Not a single radicalized Islamic suspect should be granted any measure of quarter. Their intended entry into the American homeland should be summarily denied. Every conceivable measure should be engaged to hunt them down and kill them. Hunt them down, identify them, and kill them all. For the sake of all that's good and righteous, kill them all." This is Clay Higgins, U.S. Representative from Louisiana's 3rd District on June 4th of 2017. And Facebook didn't even take this down as hate speech. So the question is, and we have a few minutes to wrap some of this up, the question is what do we do with this? What is the role of the church? How is the church supposed to respond to this? One of the things I love about the book we wrote, which is Unsettling Truths, my co-author, Soong-Chan Rah, had recently published, just a few years before we published this book, he had published a book on Lamentations called A Prophetic Lament. And in his book, he talked about lament and how lament was a, let me actually unshare my screen here. But he talked about how lament was a spiritual discipline or a practice that the church could use. And he compared it to like being at a funeral dirge. He said, when you go to a funeral dirge, you have a dead body, it's in the casket, and it's not going to come back to life. You go to the funeral to lament, to weep, to cry, to say goodbye, to mourn this loss of life. And he lays out in his book how the church, the Western church specific in general, and the American church specifically, is really anemic at the process of lament. I point out that it's very difficult to lament when you believe in your own exceptionalism. And one of the challenges we have with lament is this myth, this belief that we are, this belief in American exceptionalism. And it's so bad that even in, hold on just a second, I got to bring up this quote. That even if we were to have the church to be invited into a process of lament, and we were to lay out this history and ask the church to lament this history, I want to show you this passage. The church would most likely find comfort in this passage from 2 Chronicles chapter 7 that says, "If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sins, and I will heal their land." See, one of the challenges we have in this nation is that we truly believe that we have a land covenant with the God of Abraham. We have completely internalized this notion of Old Testament land covenant. And how many of our churches have not used this passage in our churches, in our services, when we've tried to lament an injustice, especially a national injustice. But this was actually read to the people of Israel at the second dedication of the temple. As Americans, even as American Christians, we are not God's chosen people. And North America, Turtle Island, is not our promised land. There is nothing, absolutely nothing in Scripture that says if the United States of America repents of its ways, that God will heal our land. Right? How many of you, if your son, your daughter, your child, or your grandchild stole a bike, and they came to you and said, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Grandpa, I stole this bike. It's beaten up, it's broken, it's not taken care of. I'm sorry I stole the bike. Who lets them keep the bike? Right? Who lets them keep the bike? There is nothing in our nation, in the Bible, that says if the United States of America confesses its sin and repents from its evil ways, that God heals this land. This is the challenge that we're facing as a church, is we have to figure out what do we do about this injustice, and how do we move forward into it? And we can't move forward with it until we are ready to deal with the issue of land titles. And that we have at the center of our founding documents this legal understanding that natives are savages, that people of color are not human. And this allows us to have the history that we've had, even without regret, even without feeling guilt. And so what is the role of the church? What does the church need to do to be a part of this? I want to read something for you, and I'm going to bring this, I'll bring this up. Let me bring this up on my website. I just want to read it, and you can just take some time to listen to it. I wrote this, I do a lot of work with the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And back in 2018, they asked me to write a piece for them about my prophetic message and to put it in a form of a proverb. And at that time, our nation was dealing with the injustices around around immigration. And we were having families being separated at our borders, and there was all this injustice going on in our nation around the history, around our practice of immigration. And so I wrote this for the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, and I want to share it with you today. It says, wise is the church that refuses to buy into the trappings of partisan politics. Remember, my brothers and sisters, Jesus did not come to create a Christian empire. He came to make disciples. He came to offer his body as a living sacrifice. He came to plant a church. When the church merely lobbies one political leader and protests the other, when for the sake of argument or political gain, the body of Christ turns a blind eye to one sin and magnifies another, we are not representing the headship of our body, who is Christ. As vile, repulsive, and urgent is the Trump administration's separation of families at our border, it's not the first time. Indian removal, the slave trade, boarding schools, lynchings, Japanese internment camps, mass incarceration, even the deportation numbers of the Obama administration. The list of ways the US government has worked to destroy the family structure of people of color throughout our history is as long as it is depressing. So let's stop pretending that President Trump is the God-ordained savior or the ultimate demise of our union. The same with President Obama. What our nation needs is not for Democrats to be better Democrats, nor do we need Republicans to simply be better Republicans. We don't even need our nation to be more Christian. My brothers and sisters, the United States of America is not, never has been, nor will it ever be Christian. Jesus did not come to create a Christian empire. He came to make disciples. He came to offer his body as a living sacrifice. He came to plant a church. And wise is the church that refuses to buy into the trappings of partisan politics. I agree with Kenneth Kaunda, the former president of Zambia, who said, what a nation needs more than anything else is not a Christian ruler in the palace, but a Christian prophet within earshot. One of the challenges we have as a church, because we have so deeply internalized our own exceptionalism, because we believe our job is to make our nation Christian, because we believe in the heresy of Christian empire, is that at the moment, we are actually impotent to help fix this problem. Because our solution would actually be what caused the problem in the first place, which is just to make the nation Christian. That's not the solution. That's not what we're called to do. When the church plays into the heresy of Christian empire, all we're doing is we're becoming lobbyists or protesters. That's what the church gets reduced to. We just lobby the presidents that stand on our side of the political aisle, and we protest those on the opposite side. And no one speaks truth across the board. And the nation needs groups of people, not just the church, to speak truth at all times, regardless of who's in power. But the United States, the church in America, is currently unable to do that because of the partisan divide within our churches. When Sungshan and I wrote our book, we actually took a break in the middle in early 2017 after the election of Donald Trump. And our book initially started out as a call to lament. We're laying out the history and inviting the church to lament it and enter into some healing for it. After we saw the role of the church on both sides of the aisle in the 2016 election, we sat down and decided we have to rework our entire thesis, and that we needed to bring the church to the point of being rebuked. And so our book, Unselling Truth, is absolutely a flat out rebuke of the church. This is what we've done. And at the moment, as long as we believe in this heresy of Christian empire, as long as we think our job is to make our nation Christian, we are impotent. We have no role in fixing the problem that we actually created. One of the things that I advocate for as a nation, there's a great quote by George Erasmus, who is a Dina elder from the lands now known as Canada. And he wrote a letter during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took place in Canada. And in his letter, he used this quote. He said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community, he said, you have to start by creating common memory.
Right.
I love that quote. I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we do not have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers the mythological history of discovery and expansion, of opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of internment camps, of segregation, of mass incarceration, of boarding schools. And there's no common memory. And there's actually no point in our history where we had healthy community across racial lines.
That's right.
One of the things I advocated for this before my campaign. This was a key plank of my platform, and something I'm advocating for now is that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I wouldn't call ours Truth and Reconciliation, though, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which isn't accurate. I would use the term truth and conciliation, because conciliation is merely the mediation of a dispute.
Right.
And I think we need one sooner rather than later, which is why I'm doing everything I can to help bring this conversation about. And the church absolutely needs to be involved in this, but we are not able to join it as an entity, as an institution, or even as a body until we give up this heresy of Christian empire. Until we give up this goal of trying to make our nation Christian. And so this is where I'm teaching, I'm advocating, and where I'm exhorting as much as I can today to help the church play its proper role in the injustice and oppression and dehumanization and even genocide that it not only enacted, but helped justify.
Yeah.
And I thank you for letting me talk with you today. I hope that this spurs some really
Oh,
good
my.
conversation. And I hope we can have some good Q&A now for a few minutes.
Yeah. Mark, thank you. You have gifted us so much today. We're processing, we're chewing on stuff. There's such great nuggets in here for us to
I
process.
think you got muted there.
Can you hear me now? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm just going to encourage you to buy the books. I mean, what he has shared today is critical. I think as a writer, as an author, we need to also be reflective in taking some of that and sharing it with other people. And so just know that that's another way of supporting Mark. Mark, can you share with us, where can we find you? What websites? Where can we follow you?
Yeah, I'll put a few things online. So my website, my personal website is wirelesshogan.com. And that's a great place to I didn't use it as much during the campaign, but I'm using it again now. It's a place where you can get my social media contacts and where you can read some of my blog articles. There's also some great links there. Sorry. There's some great links there to videos I put out. There's a pretty fundamental teaching I gave over the past few years. It's called the dynamics between power and authority. And I look at the dynamics between worldly power and biblical authority. And there's a video on my website under the media section where I gave a presentation at the Urban Youth Workers Conference a few years ago. And I go into depth on that dynamic. If power is the ability to act and authority is the right of jurisdiction, what does it mean for the followers of Christ to act out of authority instead of acting out of worldly power? And so you can find me online. I'm on social media. You can find me on pretty much my social media name on all platforms, which is Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and even TikTok is Wireless Hogan, WIRELESSHOGAN. And I'm fairly active on all of those, so you can follow me pretty closely there. And if you just Google my name, Mark Charles Navajo or Mark Charles Doctrine of Discovery, you'll find a plethora of resources that we put out regarding this content.
Yeah, my sense is that we will have you back, Mark. There is such richness in your wisdom and your words and your prophetic voice. It's critical. We have not worked and engaged and journeyed with Native American brothers and sisters. And I think you're just highlighted the need for us to have those relationships and those connections as part of the church. So Darren, can you wrap up this little final part, and then I will end with 2 or 3 comments.
Yeah, thanks again, Mark. This has just been an amazing way to finish up our webinar series. You've left us with a lot to think about. Just a couple of thoughts for all of us as we finish up this session, but then also this 4-part webinar series. I've been left several times throughout the last months, more than several times, left with the question, what do I do with this? And 2 thoughts that I've had, they're not the only, this is not where it ends, but at least maybe for me, it's where it begins. Number 1 is just being mindful of what I'm feeling at any given moment and just being aware of that. Am I feeling angry? Am I feeling sad? Am I feeling upset? And just noting that. And I'm trying really hard, just, at any one point in time, just checking in, and it's like, where's that? And then where's that coming from? So I would encourage you all, as you continue to engage these conversations, to do that. The second thing is I continue to look for language. I don't know about you, but I look for language of prayer, of response. And I go to the Bible, and I don't find any one passage that fully encapsulates what this moment does for me, but just a couple of prayers, parts of prayer. One comes out of Ezra chapter 9, the very beginning part of a prayer that Ezra makes. He says, I am too ashamed and disgraced, my God, to lift up my face to you, because our sins are higher than our heads and our guilt has reached to the heavens. From the days of our ancestors until now, our guilt has been great. That's a prayer that's been speaking to me at different times. Another one out of Daniel chapter 9, verse 4 says, Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned and done wrong. We have been wicked and have rebelled. We have turned away from your commands and laws. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, and our ancestors, and to all the people of the land. Just speaking for myself, white male, in the midst of all these conversations, those are some words that I have turned to at different times. And you might wonder, well, why don't you continue on in those prayers? They kind of go on to want to ask for repentance, want to see God restore things. I don't think we're there yet. I think for me, it's important that I'm sitting in the midst of, I'm uncomfortable, and I'm going to just sit in the midst of that for a while. And I'm going to let God continue to speak to me through people like Mark, through the prophets. I don't want to move too quick to a solution. I think our American white tendency has been to do exactly that. And sometimes I think God might be asking us to simply sit in the uncomfortableness and to listen more and more. And out of that, let God continue to birth a new reality. Those are my encouragements for you. Mark, again, thank you for sharing with us. I also just want to thank, as we round off our webinar, Lynn Jost and Don Morris and the U.S. Mennonite Brethren Conference for continuing to help host these events and getting the word out, advertising them, Janae, and all the work she's done behind the scenes. Thanks also to our small group facilitators. Many of them are here today, and they've been facilitating small group discussions the last other webinars. And thank you all. You've been an amazing team. Continue to look forward to working with you in various ways in the future. So thanks for all of that. Last announcement, and then Dina will wrap us up. We're going to be sending out an evaluation by email to all of you who have registered and been a part of this and the other webinars. It won't be lengthy, but we really value your input as we evaluate what we've done, as we think about ways to move forward, and how to continue to fine-tune these kinds of ways of serving and informing our conference and ourselves in the future. So be looking for that, and we look forward to your responses. Dina, what do you have for us as we finish up?
Sure, a couple of things. One is don't let today finish without you writing what are your next steps. What are your next steps on your journey to becoming committed to the work of anti-racism? I think about a couple of critical pieces that Mark gave us today. Think about the mythology versus the history. What do we know? What do we understand? And so those are important pieces. Also, a couple of pieces. Connie Faber is actually on the web here today. We have been collectively writing for the spring issue of 2021. So the entire issue will be focused on anti-racism work or understanding racism. And there are 6 contributors, 6 writers that have given some writing into that piece. So Connie, thank you for your leadership in dedicating the entire issue to the understanding of racism. A couple of key pieces we have in 2 weeks on December 15th, we'll have our last conversation on the myth of equality. It's been a very enriching experience conversation. If you don't have the book, this is a great starting point as well to the understanding of racism. And then MCC is launching a full year conversation on racism in the church. This is a book called The Color of Compromise, The Truth About American Churches' Complicity in Racism. Our first speaker for The Color of Compromise will be somebody by the name of Mark Charles that you heard today. Mark will be our guest speaker on a webinar on January 21, 2021, so this next month, the first of 4 speakers to talk to us and share with us about what are the perspectives of what God is doing and the history and all of those entities from the Asian American perspective, from the Latino perspective, from the African American perspective, and then Mark starts us off with the Native American perspective on that. Those are critical pieces as well. And I just want to say, This has been a very enriching experience, but there are many who have not joined us on this journey. Reach out to them. They're part of the body of Christ. Sometimes people are kind of fearful about how to have these conversations on race and racism. And as we've learned, to talk about them is not racist. To not talk about them is actually supporting racism. So may the Lord bless you. And we'll have a discussion and a debriefing as team leaders and facilitators. And once again, thank you, Mark. Mark, you are a gift to the church. Thank you, my brother. Your prophetic voice, your wisdom is critical for today. So thank you so much. And let's just give him a thumbs up, hand up, and then we'll end with the word of prayer. Lord, thank you. Thank you for this time. This has been holy. This has been about you. This is about going into a history that is painful and being honest about the ways in which we have missed who you are and what you call your people to be. Thank you for the prophetic voice of our brother, Mark Charles. May you bless him in the journey. May you create platforms across our nation, Lord, so that he would be a gift to the body of Christ, an awakening to who and what you are calling your church to be today. Thank you again. Bless our journey. In your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. Thank you, friends. Blessings to you.